Hi, and welcome to our book chat today from Equity Talk to Equity Walk, expanding practitioner knowledge for racial justice in higher education. I'm your presenter today. I'm Amanda Smothers. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator and currently temporarily serving also as Online Learning Co-Coordinator as well in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning at NIU. I'll be taking questions throughout at the end of the presentation. So if you have specific questions related to what we're talking about, you can feel free to post that to the chat thread. I'll address them as they come up. So if your mic isn't working, that's okay. You can just post to the chat as well. And I will read those responses out. So in the chat, let's just talk about who we are. So what's your department or division? I think several of the people who signed up for today were from psychology, I think. So what's your department or division? What's your role? What do you want to get out of this book chat today? So I'll just take a minute to do that. All right, so I was correct, psychology. So just to listen, great. So obviously, you didn't have to read the book for today. That's kind of our whole point of the book chats is we read the book so you don't have to. So I'm going to try to give as comprehensive of an understanding of what's in the book as possible today without, reading the book out to you. And it's actually a fairly short book and it's available online in PDF form. And I can send you the link for that as well. So which I will do for you at the end of the workshop today. In my post-workshop email, I'll send that out to you if you want to read it. It's only like 100 and I think it's less than 150 pages long, and it's a really quick read too. And it's really interesting. I can't get into all of the scenarios and everything that they cover in the book. Definitely recommend reading it on your own, but I'm going to try to give you a good idea of what's in there, what's valuable in it, and some of the takeaways from the book as well. So just as sort of a check-in, there's a little smiley face right above where it says type message here all the way on the right side. So if you just want to share an emoji in the chat, how you're doing today, how you're feeling, then you can do that. That's mine. A little bit of allergies over the past couple of weeks.
Sorry, I'm looking for like the sleepy one and I can't find it.
Yeah, I'm feeling that too. I think you can actually, there's a search bar. Yeah, you can search for it too, which is really neat. I'm waiting for them to catch up with Teams and allow you to use GIFs as well. Those are my favorite. All right, so let's get right into it. The book's preface, I just pulled out what I thought was a quote that really kind of encapsulated the importance of the text. So from the preface, the growing racial tensions in our society and the impact it has had and will have on our individual psyche and who we are as a nation cannot be ignored and dismissed as isolated incidents because they keep adding up. Racism permeates every aspect of our country, and the time to address the pervasive impact of ideologies fueled by hate is now. So I think that really encapsulates the reason why this text was written and why it's important. So these are some focusing questions that the authors present in chapter 1, right on the first page. So just to kind of get readers started thinking about equity and the topics that'll be discussed in the book. So first, how do you define equity? What does that mean to you? They'll give their own definition in the book, but what is your definition of equity the outset. What's your understanding of how equity and equality intersect or are codependent? And that's kind of dependent on also what the definitions of equity and equality are, what the differences are of those two terms. What are specific examples of how equity is a value for you and to your institution? So that's getting at the personal, what's the value of equity for you, specific examples, and then what's the value of equity to the institution? And then what motivates you to ensure equity at your institution? If you are motivated to do that, and I would hope that maybe you are if you're attending today's book chat. How does your understanding of equity translate into your values, beliefs, and actions? So that's kind of that piece of starting to move from equity talk to equity walk in the title of the book. And then do you have an equity talk and an equity walk? And we'll talk about what the differences are between those two things. So from chapter 1 talks about, it's the title of the book, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, and talks about what the difference is between equity talk and equity walk. On page 4, this is a quote, as pointed out by Estella Merrim Ben Simon, it seems like equity is everywhere. Equity, once viewed suspiciously as racially divisive and associated with the activism of social justice movements that academic purists disdain as advocacy work, is now being enthusiastically embraced on the academic scene. But are we truly embracing equity or just a current trend? So educators with an equity talk and an equity walk, according to the authors, critically examine institutional policies, practices, and structures through a lens that questions why inequities exist to change the educational environment to support the success of students, especially students who have been historically and continuously marginalized in education systems. So students do need to fully engage in the pursuit of their educational goals, but the institution has to create a learning environment that promotes equity and inclusion by understanding the diversity of the students that it seeks to educate. To examine equity effectively, practitioners, educators need to understand how racism and a pervasive belief in the hierarchy of human value have shaped systems and practices. So here's another quote from the text on pages 5 to 6, but they give a definition of equity from the Center for Urban Education, which defines equity as, quote, a two-dimensional concept. One axis represents institutional accountability that is demonstrated by the achievement of racial parity in student outcomes. And the second axis represents a critical understanding of the omnipresence of whiteness at the institutional and practice levels. So according to Ben Simon, who's quoted in that quote that's on the screen there, practitioners hoping to be equity-minded need to consider equity in connection with historical and political understandings of racial stratification. And also, to quote Ben Simon, the authentic exercise of equity and equity-mindedness requires explicit attention to structural inequality and institutionalized racism and demands system-changing responses. So in sum, the authors of the book argue that if we need to or want to examine equity effectively, we need to understand how racism and a pervasive belief in the hierarchy of human value have shaped our systems, our policies, our practices. And if we ignore how those structures were designed, we're ignoring the necessary process for eliminating those inequities. So the authors will go on then to explain and illustrate that definition of equity and the concept of equity-mindedness in the rest of the chapters. They give some campus vignettes, some real-world examples, some examples of data analysis, and then they also give examples of like responses to equity issues, and then how to respond in an equity-minded way. So it's really useful case studies and scenarios that they present throughout the book. Also in this chapter, they talk about how equity prioritizes the creation of opportunities for minoritized students so that they have equal outcomes and participation in educational programs, and so that those efforts can close achievement gaps in student success and completion. They also argue that in order to promote inclusivity in excellence, institutions need to have widely shared and commonly understood definitions for what they consider to be diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that those definitions need to reflect the institutional context and values. So in other words, you can't just have, a mission statement, and they talk about mission statements in another chapter as well, but it needs to be widely shared. It needs to be commonly understood. Those definitions need to be commonly understood, and there needs to be direct effort to implementing evidence-based practices that promote those efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they also outline 10 action steps informed by research, member surveys, and current practice in the American Association of Colleges and Universities Committing to Equity and Inclusive Excellence Campus Guide for Self-Study and Planning, and that came out in 2015. And those 10 steps are first to know who your students are and will be, and they explain each one of these steps in more detail, which then I will. I'll just outline the steps. And if you want some more information on any of these, then please do feel free to read through the book. So again, first, know who your students are and will be. 2, commit to frank, hard dialogues about the climate for minoritized students on your campus with the goal of affecting a paradigm shift in language and actions. 3, invest in culturally responsive practices that lead to the success of minoritized students. 4, set and monitor equity goals and devote aligned resources to achieve them. 5, to develop and actively pursue a clear vision and goals for achieving high quality learning. 6, expect and prepare all students to produce culminating or signature work. 7, provide support to students, provide support to help students develop guided plans to achieve essential learning outcomes, prepare for and complete signature work, and connect college with careers. 8, identify high impact practices best suited to your students and your institution's quality framework. 9, ensure that essential learning outcomes are addressed and high impact practices are incorporated across all programs. And then 10, finally, make student achievement, specifically minoritized student achievement, visible and valued. So that is chapter 1, and obviously a lot more information in the actual chapters, just trying to give, a good summary of what's in each of these chapters. But definitely recommend reading through and reading those scenarios and those case studies and those exemplars. So chapter 2 is on building an equity-minded campus culture. And on page 21, they say the Center for Urban Education coined the term equity-mindedness to refer to the mode of thinking exhibited by practitioners who are willing to assess their own racialized assumptions, to acknowledge their lack of knowledge in the history of race and racism, to take responsibility for the success of historically underserved and minoritized student groups, and to critically assess racialization in their own practices as educators and/or administrators. So equity, according to the authors, lets practitioners see whiteness as a norm that operates unperceived through structures, policies, and practices that racialize the culture and outcomes of higher education institutions. And equity-minded practitioners need to accept that race and racism are prevalent in higher education. So the authors try to clarify or bring clarity to the issue of equity-mindedness by considering a few basic questions. So what does equity mean? Equity for whom? What does it entail in thought and action? What does it mean to perform equity as a routine practice in higher education? And what makes individuals equity-minded? So they elaborate on those questions from a critical understanding of racial equity premised on a few basic principles. One of those principles is that equity is a means of corrective justice for the educational debt owed to the descendants of enslaved people and other minoritized populations willfully excluded from higher education. Second principle is that equity is an anti-racist project to confront overt and covert racism embedded in institutional structures, policies, and practices. And then the third principle is that equity lets practitioners see whiteness as a norm that operates unperceived through structures, policies, and practices that racialize the culture and outcomes of higher education institutions. So they argue that those three principles are essential to discussing racial equity in higher education and addressing racial equity in higher education. And they demonstrate why it's necessary to adopt a critical race stance toward equity. And then they also go on to say that, quote, these three principles allow us to understand why, despite our best intentions to be equitable toward all students, our ways of doing higher education continue to produce racial inequality in educational outcomes. And they also illuminate the human and structural obstacles that block the path towards racial equity and the responses that equity-minded practitioners can make to overcome them. So this chapter describes both the obstacles that make making campuses more equitable. There are a lot of obstacles, some structural, some individual as well. But it also then provides for each one of those obstacles an equity-minded counterexample and scenario, which I find very useful. So you can actually see how equity-mindedness would work in that particular scenario. And then the obstacles that they discuss are claiming to not see race, not being able or willing to notice racialized consequences, skirting around race, resisting calls to disaggregate data by race and ethnicity, and substituting race talk with poverty talk. And some of the, one of the important, I think, quotes from the text as well is about adopting a definition of equity that's centered on racial justice. And that's kind of getting towards a lot of these obstacles of, skirting around race, not wanting to disaggregate data by race, substituting race talk with poverty talk. And the authors say that, quote, adopting a definition of equity that's centered on racial justice does not preclude adopting definitions of other kinds of equity related to gender, income, or sexual orientation. However, these other forms of equity need to be treated separately because inequities based on race and ethnicity originate from unique historical, sociocultural, and sociopolitical circumstances, including enslavement, colonization, appropriation of territories, and linguistic hegemony. And they also argue that we should not be using euphemistic language. So in other words, we need to clarify and identify who's experiencing equity and inequity, and not use racially coded language, which can render that racial stratification invisible and enables us to skirt around the issue of race. The authors also include the pervasiveness of white privilege and institutionalized racism, evasive reactions to racist incidents, the incapacity to see institutional racism in familiar routines, the myth of universalism, and seeing racial inequalities as a reflection of academic deficiency as other obstacles to building an equity-minded campus culture. So they give some examples of how whiteness shapes the experience of white college students differently than for minoritized students. And this is inspired by the work of Peggy McIntosh. And their list of those examples include that white students, leaders, and practitioners don't see whiteness as a racial identity. That white students can take advantage of faculty office hours without feeling that their intelligence or their potential will be compromised or that they'll be seen as less than. That most white students don't have to ensure that they're using proper English when they talk in class to avoid being stereotyped. That white students don't view group work with apprehension because they don't expect to be left out. That white students can find off-campus housing without feeling scrutinized. That white students often attribute academic achievement to effort and hard work and rarely notice or acknowledge the assistance that they've received from teachers and social networks. White students also feel that they're entitled to receive extra academic support and not feel stigmatized for taking advantage of that. And that white students can usually be sure that they and their experiences will be reflected in the curriculum as well. All right, so being, according to the authors, critically race conscious means interrogating phenomena from the standpoint of race. So some questions that they pose are, in what ways could this practice program or policy disadvantage minoritized students? Who by race and ethnicity is most likely to benefit from this practice program or policy and why? How did the architects of this practice program or policy take racial equity into account, or did they? And then finally, who by race and ethnicity might not meet criteria that determine who qualifies, either to be hired, to be accepted into an honors program, to receive promise program benefits, etc. So one of the obstacles that I mentioned that they pointed out was seeing racial inequities as reflection of academic deficiency. And they talk about what the difference is between that perception or that mindset, that deficit mindset of seeing a deficit in students versus what an equity-minded practitioner would do. So they say that equity-minded practitioners would shift the attention away from the student and onto themselves and their practices. They would reframe racialized gaps in performance as an institutional dysfunction stemming from underpreparedness to perform as effectively for Black, Latinx, and Native American students as for whites. They also state that from an equity-minded perspective, racialized gaps are a catalyst to ask certain questions. And those questions are, one, what courses contribute to the lower GPAs of Black students? What causes these courses to underperform for Black students? And you can, insert, a different student population in there depending on what the results are of your disaggregated data for success rates for students are. How many sections of college level math are offered? Which among these sections perform well or underperform for Latinx students, for example? Why do they have differences in performance? Why are faculty members more likely to establish relationships with white students? What can they do to establish relationships with Native American students? In what ways do faculty discourage Native American students from seeking them out? And they argue that establishing a culture of equity-mindedness depends on leaders who go beyond rhetorical praise for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who actually model the tenets of equity-mindedness in language and action. So it's not just enough to pay lip service, in other words, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they need to actually model that. They need to act on that as well. Chapter 3 is on using and communicating data as a tool to advance equity. And this quote is from page 54. It says, "Indeed, it is crucial that institutions gather and analyze qualitative and quantitative data in order to understand student experiences, learning, and outcomes. Equally important, however, is the process during which practitioners reflect on and make sense of data to inform their actions. Simply consulting or examining data is insufficient. The perspective that practitioners use to interpret equity gaps, the questions that their interpretations lead them to ask, and what follows those questions matter as well. For example, a faculty member who views equity gaps as originating from student deficits, as we talked about in the last chapter, will take a different course of action or inaction than colleagues who ask themselves how their own practices create or exacerbate the inequalities and outcomes apparent in their data. Failing to use data in equity-minded ways can stymie institutional learning and change, leaving equity gaps unchanged. So this chapter discusses how data, when used in equity-minded ways, can help practitioners understand and address inequities experienced by racially minoritized populations. It provides some very specific examples that show some common barriers institutions face when they try to use data as a tool to advance equity. And in the Center for Urban Education's practitioner inquiry model, quantitative data disaggregated by race or ethnicity is a starting point to reveal where those equity gaps in student outcomes exist. So definitely need to disaggregate that data by race or ethnicity in order to understand where those gaps exist in order to be able to address those gaps. Oh, got somebody in the waiting room. There we go. So in the Center for Urban, in the Committing to Equity and Inclusive Excellence project teams, they talk about in this chapter who displayed a wide range of data-related institutional capacity. And they describe how a team of practitioners can begin with that disaggregated data and engage in equity-minded sense-making to identify how changes in practices might lead to narrowing those equity gaps. So on page 57, they talk about sort of the reason why making those equity gaps visible can be alarming or disquieting or nerve-wracking, why a lot of institutions don't do that, and that disquiet, that making of the equity gaps visible, causing discomfort, is a lot of the point of doing so. So seeing those equity gaps is meant to create this situation where practitioners realize that our practices aren't working as we intended them to, and we're moved hopefully to reflection that prompts us to ask, why do these unequal outcomes exist for my students? What can we do to correct that? Disaggregating the data by race specifically to reveal equity gaps can inspire us to pose critical questions about our practice, to dig deeper into our teaching practice. And then after we learn more, so we might not know right away what the action should be to close those equity gaps, so we want to educate ourselves. We want to take action to close those gaps. So they give some open-ended prompts to guide discussions of disaggregated data, and specifically data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, to promote what they call equity-minded sense-making. And some of those questions, they give, it's not an exhaustive list of questions, but some questions to get things started as, what patterns do you notice in the data? Which racial groups are experiencing equities? Name those racial groups. Which racial groups would you prioritize for goal setting? Why? What are your equity goals? What are your hunches about what might be contributing to those equity gaps? What additional data do you want to collect to better understand the gap? And what equity-minded questions might you pursue with further inquiry? So having discussions surrounding those framing questions enables us to delve deeper into whatever equity gaps are revealed by the data. And we want to also emphasize additional data collection. So after we take action, we implement changes, we want to continue to collect that data to make sure that any efforts that we put into place to close those equity gaps are based on evidence and that they're actually working. And we want to also generate additional equity-minded questions for ourselves so that we can remain focused on remediating practices instead of delving into or sliding back into that deficit-mindedness of blaming students for the inequities that they've experienced. So we want to use the data to generate questions, generate those questions, because that underscores that the equity gaps are tied to the specific policies and practices that are in place for us, particularly for those students that could be intentionally designed to better support the students who are experiencing those equity gaps. So those questions can be then pursued through practitioner inquiry, by studying our own practices, or with the insights gained acting as sort of a guide for institutional action or change. And that could be at multiple different levels. So it can be within departmental action and change, or even just kind of like a microcosm of the department. So if, instructors who teach a particular class that has equity issues. So examining that data is opening the door, in other words, to examining our teaching practices. All right, so chapter 4, and there are 5 chapters in this book. So chapter 4 is on aligning strategic priorities and building institutional capacity. On page 82, the authors say that to truly commit to and enact the values, they include mission statements, and I mentioned mission statements before, but mission statements must be widely shared and understood by internal and external constituencies. In our experience working with campuses, institutions dedicate a significant amount of time and effort to developing these statements as part of strategic planning processes, but they give little time and effort to develop or to helping campus educators, students, and external constituents understand definitions of the terms and what they mean in practice. So this chapter is highlighting institutional work that aligns with what it means to make excellence inclusive by uncovering inequities in student success, by identifying effective educational practices, and then by building those practices organically for sustained institutional change. They argue that for equity initiatives to succeed, they need to be aligned with strategic priorities and institutional initiatives. And the growing use, they point out that the growing use of the word equity in higher education has led to some vague interpretations of the meaning, a lack of clarity in widely shared and commonly understood goals and action when campuses seek to elevate equity as the core institutional value. So there needs to be a specific understanding of what that word means, what they mean when they say that word, but then also how they're translating that into practice and how that aligns with their goals. They also argue that clarity in language, goals, and measures is vital to effective, equitable practices. They point out or quote America's Unmet Promise, which is was published by the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And those authors outlined some principles for creating equity by design. And those principles, there are 5 of them. The first is clarity in language, goals, and measures, which is vital to effective, equitable practices. The second principle is equity mindedness should be the guiding paradigm for language and actions. The third principle is that equitable practices and policies are designed to accommodate differences in the context of students' learning, not to treat all students the same. So there's that equity versus equality difference there. The fourth principle is that enacting equity requires a continual process of learning, disaggregating data, and questioning assumptions about relevance and effectiveness. So it's not just like an end goal. You know, different student populations are going to have different needs at different times. And so it's a continual process of learning, of collecting that data, of questioning our assumptions, of, taking another look at it. So there isn't an end point. It's just continual. And then the fifth and final principle is that equity must be enacted as a pervasive institution and system-wide principle. So they note that, going back to talking about mission statements, they note that in promoting that first principle and the last principle of equity by design, higher education institutions tend to have those mission statements, or they have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion statements that tell the internal, external constituents what the campus values and goals are. That are those core guiding principles that are guiding the institutional efforts to advance DEI and supporting higher levels of student learning and success. So that's kind of the goal behind the mission statement. But again, as they point out, that mission statement needs to be backed up, and those terms need to be defined, and they need to translate to some sort of action as well. So the chapter also provides some examples of college diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. They provide some reflective questions that could guide campuses in achieving goals. And they note that the campus culture has changed into one that's data-centric, but also committed to equity. So they pose some questions about high quality education and how your institution defines a high quality education. So first of all, how does your institution define high quality education? And then if that's how your institution defines high quality education, what data do we collect to determine whether our institution is providing a high quality education for all students? Another question, do you have defined learning outcomes for courses, programs, and degrees? So do we have those learning outcomes defined? Are those outcomes transparent for students? How are those outcomes assessed? Are the data from assessing student proficiency of learning outcomes disaggregated? Remember, that's very important, disaggregating by race particularly. How is that data shared, and how is it used for institutional efforts as well as teaching and learning improvement efforts? So, the big picture, and then, the smaller picture of individual teaching and learning. What makes the educational practices that help students develop proficiencies in the defined learning outcomes high impact? What makes them high quality? What are our institutional metrics for measuring design quality? Are the course designs tied to what research shows will help students achieve proficiency in the learning outcomes? So are they evidence-based? And how do we know that these learning outcomes align with workforce preparation as well? They also provide some questions that educators should reflect on before trying to address equity. And these are, all tied to that mission statement being explicit, those terms being defined. So How do we as an institution define equity? How is it reflected in our institutional values as stated in that mission statement and or our diversity, equity, and inclusion statements? How is it evidenced in our practices? So what are we doing about it? What language in our current mission and or diversity, equity, inclusion statements needs further clarification? Where does it need to be widely shared or more widely shared or more prominent? How does our institution define diversity? How does it define inclusion? And how do those terms intersect with our definition of equity? And is the campus culture a culture of equity or a campus culture of equality? Is it both? If so, how did they intersect? And then finally, in what ways are we addressing racial equity? What are the specific barriers keeping us from engaging in a deep dialogue on race and racism? And are we ready to explore honestly why inequities exist in our classes and in our institution? Final chapter is on building capacity for equity-mindedness among first-generation equity practitioners. And there's a definition here. Ruth Frankenberg defines whiteness as a set of linked dimensions as follows. Whiteness is a location of structural advantage of race privilege. Whiteness is a standpoint, a place from which white people look at themselves, at others, and at society. And whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. And at the end of the chapter, they also quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who at the height of the US Civil Rights Movement said, "Rarely do we find men who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think." So this chapter examines how higher education leaders, administrators, faculty, staff, trustees, everyone involved in higher education can acquire a practice centered on the pursuit of racial equity. Important to pursuing that racial equity is understanding whiteness, which is evident in the deficit perspectives that practitioners draw on to explain racial inequity in educational outcomes within our institutions and our classrooms. And whiteness, the authors say, can be detected as the interpretive lens through which practitioners explain racialized patterns. And they do that in a few different ways. So the three ways that they outline is that they reiterate racialized tropes to explain lower rates of success among racially minoritized students. For example, saying they don't know how to be college students, or they don't know how to study, or they sit in the back of the classroom and don't participate, or they never come for extra help, or they don't go to the tutoring center. Another way that whiteness is used to explain racialized patterns is making unsubstantiated accusations of minoritized college students, gaming the system to profit from financial aid. And we've heard that racist attribution in open access colleges located in low income and segregated metropolitan areas as the explanation for large dropout rates among racially minoritized students after the first few weeks of class. And then another scenario is reaffirming debunked theories of learning intelligence and cultural predispositions to justify racial inequality in education outcomes. And all of these things have something in common, which is they're ways to shift blame onto racially minoritized students and away from practitioners, educators, and their practice. So in the tradition of the Center for Urban Education's engagement of practitioners as researchers of their own practices, the authors note that equity by design is a tool to mediate instructors learning how to establish an equity-minded classroom culture, and part of that is looking at our own practice. And the tool advises practitioners that establishing an equity-minded classroom requires deliberate, explicit, and consistent reinforcement of classroom norms and routines, which includes the regular collection of race-conscious, close-to-practice data. So race-conscious first-generation equity practitioners create syllabi and instructional materials that reflect the culture, history, and contributions of racially minoritized groups. And we'll talk more about the syllabus in just a minute. So they give some basic practices, and these are not, the easy answers, but these are steps, and we need to examine our own practice and determine what further steps we need, and always examine and look at the data. But to assist us in becoming race conscious and equity minded, there are some basic practices that can help us as educators to help racially minoritized students achieve their higher education goals. First, notice the number of students who are white and the number of students who are of color. And if we remember back, one of those problems was not acknowledging color or claiming to be colorblind. Monitor participation patterns of students by race and ethnicity. Do white males dominate discussions? Are Black and Latinx students reluctant to speak out? What do you notice? Assess whether you tend to ask complex questions of white students and simple factual questions of non-white students. Assess if you make assumptions about students' performance and engagement based on race and ethnicity. Avoid pedagogical practices that result in the exclusion of minoritized students. So for example, when students are asked to form their own groups for an activity, take precautions against students of color being left out or appearing to be outside of the group. And then finally, monitor students' attendance, completion of homework, and performance in quizzes and tests by race and ethnicity to identify patterns that can provide insights into racialized patterns. So they have a whole section in this chapter on creating a syllabus, and it's about creating a syllabi and materials that are reflective of minoritized groups. So they talk about how race-conscious first-generation equity practitioners create syllabi and instructional materials that reflects the culture, history, and contributions of racially minoritized groups. So there are some teaching practices that they mention that support the development of race-conscious practitioners among first-generation equity instructors. First is to ensure that minoritized students see themselves in syllabi, assignments, and other instructional materials like text, videos, special projects, etc. Second is to make race visible in syllabi by including text, videos, and other teaching artifacts authored by racially minoritized scholars, authors, and cultural critics. Third is to create a learning plan to become familiar with minoritized writers, poets, sociologists, political scientists, philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, artists, musicians, the list goes on, and it depends on your subject matter. But as first generation equity practitioners, we need to invest that time into learning what we haven't been taught, what our own gaps are. Also apply the questions, some specific questions to assess ways in which your syllabi communicate the value of students' racial or ethnic backgrounds as sources of learning and language. So some questions that they list are, does your syllabus acknowledge that student learning benefits from deep and rich engagement of students' racial or ethnic backgrounds and experiences? Does it include a statement that recognizes the value of racial or ethnic backgrounds and experiences that all students bring into the learning environment? Does it include readings, activities, and assignments that are culturally relevant and exclusive or inclusive? In other words, those that incorporate issues of race or ethnicity, gender, language, sexuality, and disability to show a diversity of perspectives and lived experiences. Does it include multiple assignments or discussion topics that allow students to share and draw on their experiential knowledge and or the knowledge of their communities? And then finally, does it include multiple topics and assignments on the real world problems and issues facing the communities or cultural groups from which students come? So throughout their book, they try to provide their strategy that's inspired by the power of learning to promote practitioner self-change. And their concept of first generation equity practitioners represents this quest for a solution to racial inequality that empowers professionals to remake our own practices. So just some final discussion questions. If you want to post anything into the chat, what did you learn today that you want to examine more closely by reading the book? And you don't have to answer all of these, but try to maybe pick one of these and just as some thinking ahead. What are some areas you want to work on professionally in the area of moving from equity talk to equity walk? And then, any other comments or observations that you have about today's topic. All right, great. So Brooke says to walk the equity talk, leaders need to examine their own perceptions of equity and to develop new language. We need to learn to frame racial inequality in educational outcomes as a problem of institutional underperformance, not attributed to the student. We need to stop skirting around race talk by only using terms like underrepresented, vulnerable, and first generation when we're actually speaking about Blacks, Latinx, Indigenous peoples, and other racially minoritized students. Great. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Excellent. So any questions? And I will send out an email to everybody who is here with some information about where to access the text as well if you haven't read it or haven't looked it up yet. And if you have questions, you can stick around. If not, thank you so much for joining today. Again, I'm Amanda Smothers, and you can contact me via email if you have any questions about the text or about teaching and learning or about anything else. Instructional technology as well can help you with that too. And thanks everyone for attending today.